According to educationsupport.co.uk, 75% of teaching and education staff said they have experienced a variety of stress symptoms in the last 2 years. Almost 1 in 5 said they had experienced panic attacks. Over half had suffered from insomnia and difficulties sleeping. Over a third had experienced difficulty concentrating. Teacher burnout is not simply the result of being overworked. It can be a result of prolonged stress. Today, we speak with Neil Thomas about teacher burnout. Neil talks from his experience as a teacher and school leader about dealing with burnout himself. He gives tips on how to spot it, and he also offers ideas on how to handle it. Let's dive in.
You are listening to the Teach Middle East podcast, connecting, developing, and empowering educators.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Teach Middle East podcast. This is Lisa Grace, and today I'm pleased to have with me Neil Thomas. Neil is an educator and a former school leader who used to work in Doha at Doha College, and we're discussing something really, really important today on the podcast. We're going to be talking about teacher burnout. Now, if you have been in education for any time, you would have heard about teacher burnout and what happens to teachers who, frankly, get to the end of their road with the whole process. It's quite a demanding role. And even though we all love what we do as educators, there are times when we need to take a step back. So today I'm talking to Neil, and we're going to get into the ins and outs of teacher burnout. Hi, Neil. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks for having me on. It's a real privilege to speak to you and obviously all the listeners within the Middle East and hopefully wider than that.
Excellent. Now, if you would like to just do a brief introduction before we kick off, that would be great.
Yeah, that's great. So I've been a teacher for 15 years. Started a long time ago now, but long and short of it, how I came up after 5 years of teaching in Bristol. When I started my career, I moved to Doha College as head of design and technology, which is my subject, in September 2011. I did that role for 5 years, mostly under the stewardship of Mark Leppard, who's now, of course, at the British School of Al Kabaya. And then after Dr. Stephen Summer being appointed, a year later in September 2016, I got internally promoted to become Vice Principal of Teaching and Learning, predominantly based in the secondary school, looking after areas such as curriculum, examinations, etc., but also having a wider whole school scope with something that we introduced called high performance learning, which some of your listeners may very well be aware of. And that took me up until July 2020, when I decided with a heavy heart to leave Doha College and return to the UK because of the topic of today's podcast, which is, of course, teacher burnout.
Yeah, that's true. So here's my other question for you. Why teacher burnout? Why is that topic so important to you?
Yeah, so I think it's a culmination of various factors, which I'll try and cover quite briefly. But I think why it's important right now, as in today, beginning of January 2021, obviously in the COVID world, our educators are currently battling through, there's daily challenges, weekly challenges, termly, yearly challenges. I think it's more important than ever for teachers to really get a grasp of what burnout is, the difference as well between burnout and stress. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But I think it's really important for teachers to be able to identify what they might be feeling, because teaching is a demanding job through an academic year in a normal school year, never mind, the last year since last March when really COVID kicked off. I think that's potentially had the impact of emphasizing stress, burnout for some teachers, many teachers. And I just really wanted to highlight kind of my story and also some of the key factors surrounding the topic, just so your listeners are aware, and hopefully it will help them in some way, shape or form. So it's a huge topic. I think yesterday alone, I was reading the Sunday Times, and it's a topic that's also affecting a wider audience. So in the business world in general, in sport, mental health is becoming such an important aspect of a company's responsibility, but also how employees are recognizing that and how companies need to be able to respond and support that in a much more effective way.
Because of how demanding teaching is, sometimes it's just fatigue, sometimes it's stress, sometimes it's all different factors. I mean, how can teachers know that they are at the point of burnout?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things here. So I'm going to kind of identify the difference between a very basic definition of the difference between burnout and stress. I don't profess to be any expert in this. I'm not doing an MA in it or anything like that. But what I have done quite considerably since March last year, which is the time period that I kind of identified that things weren't quite right with myself, is really I've worked with a variety of different people. So the first person was a counselor, a psychologist, in order to kind of help me identify what was going on and why. But also an old school friend, actually, Katie Phillips, who runs a company called KDP Coaching and Consulting. And Katie has been on a similar journey to me. How we got there isn't the same, but Katie had a similar kind of burnout in work and then has gone away and moved into a new career, very similar to what I've done. And Katie, on her website, and you can go and read it for yourself, but very simply identifies that there is a difference between stress and burnout. So stress, I think, sadly, most teachers experience at some point during the school year. I'm not even going to say during their teaching career, because I think at some point there is a period of time when you feel that things are too much, like you're drowning in the workload that you've got to do. We all know those points when it's January or maybe February, when you've got a bank of year 8 reports to write, you've got a year 9 options evening followed by an A-level option evening, you've got your normal teaching to do, you've got to prepare for your A-level classes. And I think that identifies stress. It is generally when you've got too many pressures that demand a lot of you, both physically and mentally. So that's stress. And I think the key thing about identifying whether it is stress or burnout is that even if you're very stressed and you're very stretched, I think you can always imagine what the end point will look like, i.e., that at the end of week 5, you've got one more week and then you've got a half-term holiday. And you know that by the half-term holiday, your workload would have eased, you would have got those reports and done the parents' evening, you're on the kind of countdown to that half-term break. And as much as senior leaders like to say, make sure you don't do any work over the half-term holiday, ultimately, a lot of teachers use that time to kind of catch up and get back up to where they need to be ready for the start of the next term. So I think that identifies kind of stress. Yes, you do feel anxious and nervous, but you can see the end point. You know that but come February half term, you're going to have a chance to catch your breath, reload, and go again. So I think that's really important for teachers to be able to understand that. So it's that drowning feeling. The difference then between that stress and burnout is conversely that you feel that everything that you do isn't enough. There isn't that end point. There isn't that kind of clear definition that you're ever going to get through what you need to get through. And this constant kind of anxiety, worry, it really does leave you feeling empty mentally. So you're just exhausted. You're like kind of done. You kind of switch off. You're devoid of kind of motivation. You don't really want to go to work, maybe. Getting up in the morning, it's hard enough anyway at 5:30 in the morning with the early get-ups in the Middle East. But I think, that motivation for why you're doing your day-to-day job disappears. And sometimes, I hate to admit it, but at points, this time last year, I was beyond caring about doing my job to the best of my abilities. And I think I didn't really have any hope. I couldn't imagine there ever being an end. And as I said, I don't think my passion for education disappeared, because I like to think that educators always have that passion. But what it did do was I felt as if I wasn't really having an impact. I felt like I didn't want to, go to my SLT meetings. And that wasn't because of the environment. My leadership group were incredibly supportive of me at all times. It was just something inside of me that for the first time in my life, in my 15 years, I didn't want to be in school. And that was the long and short of it, as sad as that is to say. If it's okay, Lisa, just need to frame that a little bit, in that kind of was also amplified potentially for me, because in April 2019, I got diagnosed with testicular cancer. So term 3 of the 2018-2019 year, I wasn't actually in school an awful lot. I got diagnosed, fortunately, it was stage 1, had an operation, had 2 rounds of chemotherapy, and I've been all clear ever since, which obviously is amazing, and I'm very grateful for that. But I had the 2 months summer holiday, and then at the end of August, I wanted to return, and I think that's really important. There was no pressure from Stefan at the time, or Ruth Sanderson, the head of secondary at Dover College. They were nothing but supportive. I think if I had asked to have until Christmas off, I would have been able to have that. But there was a hunger inside of me to get back into the day-to-day work. So I threw myself back into life, life, but also school life, doing my daily job. I got to Christmas and I was exhausted. I'd never felt anything like it. I went back, like I just said, you recover over your Christmas break and you go back in January full of it. And I'd always done that in the 15 years, but something was different. And that is when really I kind of noticed the burnout. I kept going until February. We had 2 inspections because I wanted to be there for the team, for the school, to get the best result possible. But then I think early March, I just remember I didn't physically collapse, but mentally I collapsed in a meeting with Stefan. I cried. I'm not afraid to admit that, and I just broke down, and I was just broken. I think is a good term, and that's when I knew it was fatigue from the chemotherapy, built up fatigue from the chemotherapy that was playing a part as well. But I also know that through the work with my counsellor, it was a build up of 15 years of hard work, going at school 100 miles an hour, committing everything during those 15 years to a job that I love. And it just all caught up with me, and I just needed a break. And that's when I decided to resign.
Do you know what? A lot of what you said resonated with me on a lot of levels. I mean, I worked in education for 20 some odd years at varying levels, from teaching right the way up to being a principal. And I know that at a certain point, I mean, I've only stopped being full-time in education for the last 2 years, as in running a school. And so I know firsthand what it feels like to be at that point of burnout, where you're like, okay, I definitely don't want to get up. I definitely want to hear the alarm clock and go under the bed instead of getting out of the bed, which is not a good place to be. But what I find is that a lot of teachers don't feel comfortable in talking about these things, and they hide it. Because, to be frank, within schools, many schools, and this is changing, so let's be happy for hope. But in many schools, if you mention anything to do with your mental well-being, you are seen as weak. Even if you're a fantastic teacher all the way up to that point, as soon as you start talking about feeling tired or a little anxious, or dare I say burnt out, you are now looked at as a liability. How can we change the outlook? Because people are going to be afraid to come forward. How can we get people to come forward if we're not willing to change? What do you say to teachers who are really hiding in the shadows right now on the brink of a breakdown?
Yeah, I think, first of all, it's probably, there's a little bit of self-awareness there. I think teachers within themselves have got to take time to reflect, take stock of where they are, why they might be feeling like they are. Is there a particular reason? So, for example, we've talked about the particularly busy time after New Year, after Christmas break or winter break. When you come back, you've got the options evenings, you've got the parents' evenings, you've got the reports to write, you've got, and that's quite often before February half term. Never mind the work you've got to do before Easter, preparing students for GCSE and A-level exams. Maybe not this year, maybe who knows about that debacle. But I think there's got to be a little bit of self-awareness. People need to understand their own basic minimum needs. So what I mean by that is that everybody's tolerances are very different. That what I perceive or what I think is stressful, it might be very different to yours, Lisa. And I think you've got to identify people's personal lives are going to be vastly different. People may have 3 children at home. Some people may have 0. You've got 2. So, your circumstance is very different to mine because I haven't got any children. So I think the first key thing is to understand and identify your own basic thresholds. So what is causing you that stress or that anxiety? Let's start off there. Is it something that you can see the end of the light on and you know that the next 3-4 weeks is going to be a bad patch? Is there something that you can do at home to make your kind of outside of life a little bit easier, so that life inside work, it becomes a little bit better. Do you need to ask support off your partner to take them to an extra after school session or pick them up from somewhere instead of you being the person running around, for example? Once again, I'm not a parent, so I can't speak in that area too much. But, it's a little bit like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you did that for yourself, what's the base? What's the bare minimum you need to be comfortable, both at home but also at work? What does that look like at work? Does it mean making sure you get in for half an hour before the day starts, check your emails, have a cup of coffee, and then you're good to go? Or, does it mean putting aside one of your PPA lessons every fortnight? And I know this isn't easy to do when there's so much to do, but, is it worth putting half an hour to go away and do some self-reflection where you are, read blogs, keep yourself in education, but, refresh yourself a little bit and then go again for the second half of the week, for example. So I think that self-awareness is key. Those coping mechanisms, what can you identify to make you feel better? I think, I'm a strong believer in exercise, and quite often exercise is an easy thing to dump off your list because you don't turn up to a class or you don't go for that run. But actually, there's a multitude of research that shows exercise really does help those endorphins, makes you feel better. Even if it's 2 or 3 sessions a week for 20, 30 minutes, that is really something that you can put aside to help do. Other coping mechanisms you could look into. And once again, there's reams of research and various people far more intelligent than I to speak about this. So journaling, I've started journaling recently. I don't do it every day, but I write down 3 things that I'm grateful for, 3 positive things. And then I kind of give myself a little tick off sheet. So on my list is always stretching, exercise, and eating well. So have I done those 3 things? I don't beat myself up if I haven't done them, but also it's good to reflect back. I think coming back to your point, if they work through those things and they still believe that they're going towards burnout or may already be burnout, I think the way I would look to approach it is, once again, the counsellor that I worked with after my cancer said that self-compassion is really important. In that, once again, if you'd stepped out in front of a car and broken your leg, both legs, and you couldn't go to school, physically couldn't go to school, would your head teacher or your headmaster or your principal expect you to be in school teaching all day? Well, probably not. But certainly for the first 2, 3, 4 weeks. And I think mental illness is a little bit like that. But the big difference is other people can't see what's wrong. And therefore, they haven't necessarily understood your situation. And I think anybody who is worried or hiding in the shadows, is a really nice term that you used earlier, that is hiding in the shadows and doesn't want to come forward. I think you've got to remember that. I think you are the only person that can step forward and have that conversation with your principal. You've got to have the confidence that it will be understood. I think, once again, Lisa, as you highlighted, it is becoming an area that is becoming more understood by school leaders, which I'm really glad to see. And, it may just be you need a week off. I think teachers also, in my experience, drag themselves in over hot coals because we're so dedicated to our students. And I think that is an amazing thing about teachers.
It is. I remember going to school sick, so I know you're so right.
Yeah, absolutely. But ultimately, and I know these young people's futures are a little bit in our hands, but a good school with a good leadership team will have your classes covered. And if it's for a week, and if it needs to be 2 weeks, 3 weeks, your head of department, your vice principal in charge of cover will work together in order to make sure your GCSE and A-level classes are getting what they need. The other factor that plays in there is that I think because we get such good holidays, teachers quite often feel they can only be sick during those holidays, which is ridiculous.
But they're working through those holidays, many teachers are.
Yeah, we both know that. But I think that plays into the mindset of, right, I can't go and see because there's nothing physically wrong with me. I haven't got a bad arm. I'm not sick. But in your headspace, there is something going on and you're burnt out and you don't want to come to school. Take a break. I would encourage teachers to speak to their leadership team. Go to someone you're comfortable speaking to about it within that leadership group. Leadership groups talking and amongst each other, to work around problems. And once again, I can't praise the support I had at Dover College enough, because Stefan, Ruth Sanderson, and the rest of the leadership team there, were incredibly quick to take anything they could away from me in order to allow me to do that. And maybe it was easier to do slightly because I was a senior leader. I didn't have any teaching classes. But nevertheless, I'd also hope that would have been the same for a science teacher, a French teacher, whoever that was.
I mean, that leads me nicely into my next question, because Doha College, you were fortunate to have that supportive senior leadership team, and your colleagues were willing to help you. But schools now need to start really being intentional about how they help teachers with their mental health. Having been through something like that yourself, what can schools do to support constantly and intentionally?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think I'd like to think all schools are continuously looking to improve, and I think that chase to continuously improve sometimes can mean that schools are such fast paced in what they're trying to achieve that I think that well-being and support for staff quite often takes a bit of a back burner, which is sad to say. So I would really encourage leadership groups and school leaders to really consider what can be taken away from what you do on a day-to-day, on a termly, on a yearly basis that could potentially be, given back to your staff in order to help them with their well-being. I think whilst everybody likes to receive a Kit Kat or a chocolate bar in their pigeonhole towards the end of term, whilst that is a nice gesture, I think that staff would, much prefer other options. Can you afford teachers to come in for a half day twice a year? Can they get a lie-in for 2 mornings where they have a duvet morning or something like that?
That would be the dream.
It would be the dream. And I fully appreciate that isn't always possible because of cost constraints to cover how many staff you've got in your school, etc. But I do think leadership groups or principals, where and if they can, particularly in today's climate of COVID, not adding any extra pressures onto teachers, such as, the requirement to do X amount of CPD this year. I think, that could quite easily be removed because, the focus on home learning. I know many of the schools in the Middle East, well, I know Dover are back in school, but for example, British School of Al-Kabaya aren't. So, what can the principal or the head teacher do to alleviate some of that yearly stress? And don't forget that this is, it's a long school year. Inset days, another classic example. Inset days are valuable for many reasons. But, can one of those inset days be a well-being day? Yes, staff are in school, but actually they're just left to their own devices. They don't have to go to meetings. They don't have to go to CPD, someone talking in the hall. Can it be a well-being day where they're with their colleagues?
Good idea.
Yeah. So I think well-being and support of staff in schools could potentially be rethought a little bit. However, as I know from working, in a high-performance school like Dover College, there is also that constant need to drive forward what you're doing. I just think the balance there needs to be settled out a little bit more in order to allow staff not to feel so exhausted when they get to February half term or whenever that next holiday is. And once again, I'll come back to particularly at this time with COVID, the constant changing picture that teachers and school leaders find in front of them. And it's not only burnout with teachers, I think it's burnout at that top end. I do really care and worry about principals of these amazing schools in and around the Middle East.
Yeah, we had a look at that recently, and an ex-principal from Kuwait, Kieran Peacock, he did a piece on what are the leaders going through, because we're talking about teacher burnout, but there is a big leadership burnout that's taking place with the constant changes and the plans they have to put in place at the last minute to make sure school still functions, whether it's hybrid, online, or in person. So spare a thought for your leaders out there in the schools.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I would say there is that, depending on where you are in the school, the leadership group decisions that leadership are taking, once again, everybody's experience is slightly different and everyone will have a different viewpoint. That's a difficult aspect of being in school leadership, as we both know. But ultimately, those leaders are doing the best for the students at your respected schools. And, I do seriously worry about leadership burnout because of, the reactionary aspect that schools have to take in and around COVID at this current moment. But, if you took COVID away, it's the day-to-day decisions that you make, regularly as a leadership group that, have huge ramifications yourself. Like me as a leader, by this time last year, I didn't want to be in meetings because I was fed up, I was exhausted, I was done. And that will come back at some point, I've got no doubt. But admittedly, in the first 6 months of going down a different route and doing some educational consultancy, I wouldn't want to be ahead in the current climate at the minute, anywhere in the world, because of the reaction, the day-to-day reaction to COVID that those principals have to battle with every day. And I take my hats off to every single leader, school teacher, support staff member working in schools at the moment, because they're doing a terrific job. But yeah, they need to also think about their own well-being and their own burnout.
Definitely. Well, that leads us nicely into what's life like after burnout. Is there life after burnout? And what are you doing nowadays?
Yeah, I think there is, for sure. That I'm in a hugely better place than I was a year ago. I think that process started when I decided to leave the school. But not only that, I mentioned following the two inspections, and it wasn't anything to do with the inspections, why I kind of burnt out. It was the 15 years prior to that, and particularly the last 18 months. But I think having support of Stefan and Ruth and the rest of the leadership team to alleviate some of my responsibilities, that really helped me. Stefan gave me some time off. I think it was in and around exactly when the school broke, or schools in Qatar shut because of COVID. It happened to be that week. And then I had time off until Easter. So I must have had about 3 weeks off, sick. And then the last term 3, so my last term at Dover College, Stefan gave me very specific jobs to do. So I had about 3 different projects that he kind of said, I want this to be a kind of leaving shot, if you like, at Dover College. All very productive things. We were moving schools, so I oversaw the move of the school, etc. And I think that really helped because that helped me stay useful in one sense, but also that it allowed me time to recover. I wasn't as busy as I would have been in a normal situation. So that was the first thing. And then, I made the decision to leave the Middle East, which in itself was a hugely difficult decision for my wife and I to make. We loved Doha. We loved Doha College. We loved our 9 years there. We had an incredible time. And to be honest, prior to us making this decision last year, I didn't want to return to the UK. I was always going to stay in international teaching. I loved it that much, whether it was Europe or Asia or somewhere else in the Middle East. But perspectives change. And I've always been someone that's chased the next stage. I've always had a 5-year plan at NQT. I want to be head of department in 5 years. Then got to head of department. I want to be VP after 5 years, which I did. And then my next plan was obviously a head of secondary or, a headship of some sort. But I think that's another aspect of the burnout. It just knocked me for 6 and I didn't want to. So I thought, right, let's go back home, home safe. So I'm now back in Haverfordwest in lovely Pembrokeshire when it's not raining. And, I've gone down the educational consultancy route and that's been amazing. It's very different. You haven't got your end of month paycheck coming in as you do when you're a school teacher, but you work in a slightly different way. I think that the Middle East, what it does do, and what I would encourage your learners to do, is gives you a fantastic list of contacts in order to go and do various work for, so keep them. But it's also about getting into schools. I've been into a few schools now just for the odd day to visit friends that are teachers in other schools to start to get myself back into education life back here in Britain. I've loved being home for the last 6 months. You forget things like the seasons. It snowed yesterday, first time in 9 years I've seen snow in Britain anyway. Also, when it turned to autumn, you forget about the leaves changing. It's all those really nice things, being close to the family, although because of COVID, I might as well be in Doha. I haven't been able to see them. So nevertheless, we've settled very well and come back to the UK, but which once again was never on our radar before this time last year, has been absolutely the right thing for us to do to recenter. I've got my love back for helping out educational establishments, and it's helped reignite, what I lost, long and short of it. So I felt that break was needed.
Oh, that's excellent. I mean, even though your return wasn't planned, there are quite a few teachers who are indeed planning to return, whether they're from the UK or other countries. I mean, let's take the UK, for example. If a teacher is planning to return, what do you think they should do to prepare? How can teachers prepare for a move back home?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Knowing that you were going to ask that question, I actually contacted a couple other teachers that have returned back from Dover College, back to the UK for some advice. One key difference, I guess, is that I haven't gone straight back into school. So I didn't start September teaching DT, Haverfordwest Comprehensive School. I've done it slightly differently, but I think one of the things that myself and the other Sass James, who's down in Buckinghamshire, is someone I talked to, is that going back into UK schools can be quite a shock. The length of the day is longer. The weather is different, and that plays a part. You get wet going to school. You're wet when you're, all those sorts of various aspects. It's dark 8 a.m. when you get in. It's dark at 4 p.m. when you leave, so that can get used to. But I think one thing that is really important is to try not to compare your life in the Middle East to that of the UK. Majority of people that consciously choose to return back to the UK have done so for a reason. That might be family. It might be to take a break like I have for an academic year to see, reassess. And I think what's important there is to remember the reasons why you've come back. You've come back for family. You've come back to be back in your house that you haven't really lived in for the last 5 years. I don't know, whatever the reason is, always remember that. And try not to compare that to, your former life, the brunches on the weekend and the nice car, and life in the UK is different. And you've got to kind of knowingly accept that moving back, which we certainly have tried to do. It's also not easy with friends and family. I think people need to be aware of that. It's not certainly something I wasn't really aware of until I moved back, in that people's life, I've been away for 9 years. People's lives here have moved on without you in them. So all of a sudden, you coming back, you're adding something to their life.
Yeah.
Something positive, of course, because your family or friends or whatever. But that takes some readjusting. It's not a case of you just slipping back into the way it used to be. It's 9 years.
Yeah, they've moved on. Yeah.
Yeah, they've moved on. And, you're always going to be important to them. But just be patient with that, I think. I've been back 6 months. I'm getting there. Sass, once again, my good friend that I spoke to, said that it took her about a year to get back into a normal routine that she was comfortable with, or what she thought was a normal routine from 5, 6 years ago when she left. So, yeah, just enjoy the little things. Enjoy coming back to the UK, for example, and your home comforts. I think, I've really enjoyed that more so than I thought I ever would. So, yeah, it's good. It's nice to be back. And not that I'm encouraging people to leave the Middle East, but if you do take that decision, then, yeah, have trust in that. Your experience in the Middle East also, I think, is well thought of. You may have had a promotion, you may have become a middle leader, but your international context and the wider understanding of your world will be far greater than those people that haven't traveled, for example, or left the UK or lived abroad. And I think that's a really powerful point to leave you on, really, both with students, teachers, and parents at your schools, is that you've got a slightly different view on things, and that can be a real strength.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you so much. I think that's a nice way to wrap it up. How can people reach you if they want to get in touch with you? What's the best way for people to reach you?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Neil Thomas Edu. So Neil Thomas, obviously, EDU. It will be on the Middle East podcast. And then I'm also on LinkedIn, looked up Neil Thomas. And yeah, if anybody wants any help, support, I don't know, me to work with staff, whatever else, I'm more than happy to do that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Neil, for sharing with us. I'm sure, like myself, a lot of people found this episode very, very relatable and very necessary, especially during these times. If you need any assistance, mental health, etc., talk to someone. Do not keep it to yourself. Do not bottle it up. Make sure you find someone that you can trust, that you can talk to. I want to thank Neil again for joining me on the Teach Middle East podcast.
Thank you ever so much for your time, Lisa.
Thank you for listening to the Teach Middle East podcast. Visit our website, teachmiddleeast.com, and follow us on social media. The links are in the show notes.